Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be talking about something I know is on a lot of our minds, especially if you're a parent or maybe even thinking about becoming a parent one day, and that is how to raise those little humans.
It is quite the task.
It is. So, you guys wanted us to take a deep dive into Paul and Billie Kaye Tsika's book, Parenting with Purpose, Winning the Heart of Your Child. And I think what people were really looking for were those key insights that you can really apply to make a difference without getting so bogged down in the details that it's overwhelming.
Yeah,
So our goal today is to really pull out that core wisdom from their experience, and they kind of have this blend of biblical principles and then modern psychology that they incorporate.
right.
I think what's really interesting about them is that they are so honest about their journey, the good, bad, the ugly, and you know what they learned along the way. So why don't we start with just a general overview of the book, what it
Yeah.
contains, and then we'll dive into some of those really key principles.
Yeah, I think this book is really special because it's not some ivory tower parenting perspective.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
right.
the Seekers have a very practical, hands-on approach. It goes beyond just managing behavior, and it's really about building that deep connection with your kid and fostering genuine character development.
Uh-huh.
So as I was going through this book, I was struck by how many people in their community, pastors, leaders, really endorse their approach.
Yeah.
And it's structured in a way that feels like a roadmap. It's guiding you through the different stages, different key principles. And one of the things that makes this book so relatable, I think, is the personal stories that they share, both their own and their kids.
Mhm.
They're very clear that they're not academics. They're not writing a textbook here. They're sharing lessons learned in the trenches, from the school of hard knocks, as they put it.
I love that School of Hard Knocks.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why they even wrote this book. The Tsikas are very clear that they think parenting isn't just this personal family thing. They actually see it as something with huge implications for the world. Yeah. So they advocate for being really intentional about how we raise our kids. And it all starts with this vision, like what kind of adults do we hope they'll become? And then we parent with that end in mind.
Right.
I think what's also really great about the book is they really stress that it's meant to help parents enjoy their children.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, if you're a parent, you know that's not always easy.
Yeah, it's tough sometimes.
It's tough. And it's to grow alongside them. But to do that, you need to have a plan, you know? So they emphasize these core principles,
Mhm.
simplicity, consistency, and honesty. And I think that for them, it really boils down to winning your child's heart.
Yeah.
Because they believe that opens the door for them to capture God's heart as well.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is like right out of the gate, like the first section of the book is called Building Better Kids.
Okay.
And they immediately challenge this idea of parenting as purely a results-driven activity.
Okay.
It's like, are they getting good grades? Are they winning games? Are they behaving?
Right.
We can get really caught up in that. But instead, they urge us to shift our focus to who our children are at their core. So instead of just focusing on grades and achievements, the real insight here is to prioritize who your child is as a person.
Uh-huh.
Think about it. Like, how often do we default to asking our kids, like, how was school?
Yeah.
Instead of, how are you feeling?
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
And it's so important to understand what kind of world our kids are navigating these days.
Oh, yeah.
And the Tickas do touch on how this constant stimulation and the crazy fast pace of today's society in the digital age can really erode that parent-child connection. You know, with packed schedules and digital distractions, quality time becomes incredibly valuable, but often it's really scarce. It's so hard to fit in.
Yeah, and it really puts a premium on those interactions that we do have.
Exactly.
And they raise this critical question of what's our target as parents?
Hmm.
It's not just about filling their days with activities, keeping them busy, and making sure their resume looks good for college. What kind of adults are we aiming to raise?
Right.
And without that clear picture in mind, it's so easy to get lost in just, keeping them busy.
Well,
And this is where they introduce the Search Institute's 40 developmental assets. Now, this might sound overwhelming, but it's essentially a research-backed list of key ingredients that help kids and teens thrive.
okay, so let's break down those 40 developmental assets a little bit. Basically, they're presenting it as a blueprint for healthy development that's grounded in research. And they break it down into categories like support things like family and community backing, having people in your corner. And then there's empowerment, boundaries and expectations, constructive use of time, positive values, social competencies, and positive identity.
Right. And within each of those, you have specific assets.
Okay.
So, for instance, under support, you'll find family support,
Yeah.
which is feeling loved and encouraged by family members. And community involvement, feeling connected to and supported by the broader community. Empowerment includes things like young people are valued and appreciated by adults in the community. Boundaries and expectations involve family has clear rules and consequences, and adult role models model positive, responsible behavior.
Okay, so then you get into positive values, and you got things like caring, meaning showing empathy and compassion, and responsibility, accepting accountability for one's actions. And then social competencies include things like interpersonal competence, meaning you have healthy relationships, resistance to negative peer influence. And then for positive identity, you see things like self-esteem and sense of purpose. It's pretty comprehensive when you look at what kids really need to develop in a healthy way.
It really is, and what the Tsikas emphasize is that, if you think about those assets at the very beginning of the list, those are heavily focused on relationships, especially the bond between a child and their parents. And they point out that kids learn so much about social interaction just in those early years from the adults around them,
Right.
before peer influence really takes hold. And this is key. While these assets encourage striving for your best, there's no mention of top grades, athletic stardom, or even perfect Bible memorization.
Yeah.
The focus is squarely on building character.
Right.
And they even touch on something that I think might surprise some parents, which is the value of downtime and even boredom
Yeah.
in sparking creativity and imagination rather than constantly needing external entertainment.
That's so counterintuitive to, today's just constant go, go, go and all the screens.
Right. And it can be really hard for parents to just let their kids be bored.
Ah.
But it's so important. It forces kids to look inward and come up with their own ideas.
Exactly.
The Tsikas also make a strong case for the importance of family meals. They see these as more than just a way to get food on the table, but they're opportunities for connection, for sharing, for building those lasting memories. And they share some really warm, personal stories about having guests over, everything from well-known Christian leaders to just, missionaries, and how much their kids valued those interactions. They also talk about the simple joy of listening to their own children and grandchildren just chatting around the dinner table.
I love that. So really, it boils down to there's no magic bullet.
Right.
It's about loving parents who set boundaries and stick to them. They guide their children into positive activities, give them space to figure things out on their own, encourage them to try their best, talk to them, and just love them unconditionally.
Right. It's a reminder that even with all the modern complexities of parenting, the heart of good parenting remains pretty consistent.
So we've talked about the Tsika's initial focus on the heart of the child. So how do we actually put that into practice? So they delve into these crucial elements of establishing what they call a firm foundation. And this is that ongoing process of guiding and nurturing our children to become those resilient, responsible adults that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And they cautioned against just falling back on how we were raised. Either blindly repeating those patterns or, swinging to the opposite extreme just because we didn't like our own childhood.
Yeah.
They emphasize the importance of consciously developing a parenting approach that's rooted in our own deeply held values and beliefs.
And then they use that powerful image from Psalms 127 comparing children to arrows.
Right.
And they bring in that quote from Oswald Chambers, God is preparing his arrows.
Yeah.
Which speaks to this idea that our kids are born with this incredible potential, but it needs our loving guidance and support to help them reach their full God-given purpose.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is how they connect this idea of a firm foundation to the potential pitfalls of always giving in to young children in the moment.
Yeah.
They explain that while it might seem easier in the short term to placate, like a toddler to avoid a tantrum, consistently avoiding setting clear boundaries early on can really create problems down the road when those kids are bigger and those appeasement tactics no longer work.
And they really get into the weeds about the different ways kids' brains develop, especially highlighting how differently young children think than teenagers. So they point out that in the first decade, kids tend to think very concretely. It's black and white. And then during puberty and adolescence, the brain goes through this massive rewiring.
Oh, yeah?
They call it neural pathway pruning and superhighway building.
Yeah, think of it like during adolescence, the brain is reorganizing. Some connections get stronger and others kind of fade away. And that explains why teens might seem to forget things that they knew as kids. Their brain is literally rewiring. And as parents, our consistent guidance helps solidify the highways of, positive behavior and decision-making. And they explain how sometimes during that under construction phase, it can feel like teenagers have temporarily misplaced the common sense they had as kids.
You're telling me. But the key point here is the purpose of that strong foundation of love and boundaries and discipline. So the Pitikas argue that it provides this essential bedrock for building character, integrity, maturity, and the ability for self-direction.
Right.
They even point to the fruits of the Spirit from Galatians as, those qualities we should be helping to cultivate in our children.
Exactly. And that moves us into this next really critical section, which is all about being the right example.
Okay.
They emphasize that profound impact of what our kids see us do.
Uh-huh.
The idea that lessons are caught rather than taught. And our children are constantly watching us, absorbing our behaviors, and naturally they tend to imitate what they observe.
Right.
It's so true. They point out that our actions always speak so much louder than our words, especially when it comes to how we handle stress, how we show kindness, how we pick ourselves up after challenges. Even the way we discipline our children becomes a powerful example of how to solve problems.
Uh-huh.
Do we stay calm and rational, or do you lose our temper? Our kids are taking it all in.
They also make this important point that parenting isn't just about our kids growing.
Right.
It's a significant journey of growth for us as parents, too.
For sure.
And they suggest that God can actually teach us incredibly valuable lessons through our children if we're open to seeing it.
That's right. And that's where they encourage us to really look inward. They talk about the importance of reflecting on our own upbringing.
Yeah.
Identifying any past hurts or injustices that we experienced and making a conscious effort to forgive those. And this helps us break any negative patterns and deliberately choose the kind of parents we want to be rather than just reacting based on our own past.
Yeah, and they highlight the value in sharing positive family traditions and stories with our children.
Yeah.
It creates a sense of belonging, a positive heritage, and gives them these models or examples that they can draw upon as they navigate their own lives. And then they underscore the importance of the example set by a loving married couple, emphasizing things like mutual respect, teamwork, and leadership in the home as guidance rather than control.
Yeah.
Even the way couples handle disagreements becomes a powerful lesson for their kids.
That's right. And given how much the cultural landscape around family has shifted, they address, the challenges to the image of the American father.
Uh-huh.
They reaffirm the enduring roles of fathers as spiritual leaders in the home and as protectors of the family, stressing that bedrock importance of trust and being someone who keeps their word. And they even share a personal story about how Billie Kaye's supportive attitude during Paul's extensive travels prevented it from having a negative impact on their children. And it just highlights how the attitudes and actions of both parents shape the whole family environment.
So now let's talk about early training. They caution us against overcorrecting for our own childhoods in ways that might unintentionally allow our children to shirk responsibility or develop a victim mentality.
Yeah, this is a really insightful point. Because, our goal isn't simply to fix what we felt was wrong in our own upbringing, but to really understand each child's unique personality, how God designed them, and to guide them accordingly, rather than trying to fit them into our own preconceived ideas. They also point out how often children mirror their parents' reactions when things get tough.
So the primary goal of this early training, according to the Tsikas, is to show love by setting and enforcing boundaries that keep our kids safe. So these limits, they protect them from carelessness, poor judgment, foolish mistakes, and they give them this practical framework for how to interact with the world around them.
Right.
I love that image they use. It's like trying to train a young sapling versus trying to bend a fully grown tree. It's much more effective to start early and be consistent.
Absolutely. And, they circle back to this crucial idea of focusing on the heart of the child.
Yeah.
Just changing outward behavior isn't enough. Real discipline happens when a child understands that they've done wrong,
Yeah.
they genuinely feel sorry for it, and they receive forgiveness. And they encourage parents to think back on their own childhood discipline. What made them feel ashamed, what made them rebel, what felt personal versus addressing the action.
Yeah.
And to aim for teaching moments that truly stick.
Yeah, and they advocate for using natural consequences as this really effective teaching tool. So when a child makes a mistake, instead of just punishing them, you help them understand the direct result of their actions and involve them, in an age-appropriate way in making things right.
Exactly.
So if they spill their juice, they help you clean it up.
Right. And that leads us to the topic of edifying correction.
Mm-hmm.
And the Sikhs, they're aware of this ongoing debate around spanking. And they acknowledge the opposition from groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as just this broader international trend against corporal punishment.
And they are very careful to distinguish between what they see as biblical spanking for correction and any form of child abuse,
Right.
which they state very clearly is never acceptable.
Right. And they emphasize, that when the Bible talks about the rod, it's referring to a tool used for guidance and correction, never for, like, anger or out of frustration.
So what's really key here is their emphasis on the entire proverb. The rod and reproof give wisdom. They stress that reproof, which means verbal correction and discussion, is this vital part of discipline.
Yeah, it's not just about the physical act. It's about talking through what happened, why it was wrong, and what can be done differently next time. And discipline isn't complete until there's that sense of reconciliation between the parent and the child. They see crying as a way for a child to release guilt, and the conversation afterwards as the way to rebuild the connection and reinforce the lesson.
And they advocate for training children to respond to a calm instruction the first time. They caution against those endless, repeated warnings and threats that can erode your authority over time. And they frame spanking as one potential way to help a child recognize the seriousness of their actions and lead them towards repentance. They see it as simple, direct, and relatively brief, but they consistently reiterate that repentance, that change of heart, is the ultimate goal.
Right, and they acknowledge that as children get older, alternatives to spanking, like the loss of privileges, often become more appropriate. The Tsikas themselves share their own discipline approach, which is using a normal, calm tone and giving a clear instruction once, without resorting to threats or bribes.
So really what they're getting at here is this idea that discipline means teaching. They want us to reframe how we think about discipline, moving away from just punishment and towards the idea of guiding, instructing, mentoring, like a disciple learning from a teacher. The goal really shifts to learning and growth rather than just stopping a behavior in the moment.
Exactly. They see parents as taking on the roles of coaches, teachers, even spiritual guides for their children. They emphasize that unique bond that we have. And, they point out that often when we think about parenting education, the focus is so much on crisis management. How to deal with tantrums or defiance. And not enough on understanding our children's unique gifts and helping them develop into the people that God intended them to be.
I love the way they break down the key elements for healthy development. There's wisdom, which involves understanding, insight, good judgment, emotional control. Then there's understanding, which includes discernment and seeing things from God's perspective. And accepting responsibility, being accountable, and offering solutions when things go wrong.
And they also draw a clear line between true discipline and things like just giving in to keep the peace. They call appeasement.
Or constantly nagging, or badgering, as they put it, or trying to manipulate our kids. And they remind us that children are always observing us and learning what gets them the results they want.
Yeah, they highlight the negative impact of those repeated instructions and warnings. Kids learn pretty quickly that they don't have to listen until mom or dad are practically yelling. And they emphasize breaking that cycle and regaining respect by changing our behavior.
Being clear and consistent the first time. And Billie Kaye shares a very relatable story about repeatedly telling, young Tommy to put his shoes away and how he'd learned to just tune her out until she raised her voice.
It's so true. And then there's that other important distinction that they make about rewards. So they say rewards should be given out of love and appreciation, not as this bribe contingent on good behavior. So obedience is the baseline expectation.
Exactly. And conversely, they caution against withholding love and affection as a form of punishment.
Emphasizing that love and approval should be unconditional, especially during times when we're addressing misbehavior.
So now we come to this idea of understanding what they call the spirit or the bent of each child. So their individual talents, their unique way of seeing the world, their God-given inclinations. And they reference Proverbs 22.6, which talks about training up a child in the way he should go. They emphasize that our role as parents is to discover and nurture these individual qualities, not try to force our children into some preconceived mold of who we think they should be.
Yeah, they differentiate between that general training, things like morality and respect, and the more specific cultivation of their individual bents. And they warn against pushing them too hard in areas that aren't a natural fit and potentially causing burnout. Ultimately, they see parents as guides, consultants, coaches in this process, not dictators.
I love that.
Yeah.
And, they talk about finding joy in seeing your children thrive in their chosen paths.
Absolutely, and building on that understanding of each child's unique spirit, they go into a whole section on understanding the spirit of your child.
Okay.
And they outline 6 key elements for communication that really build connection and strengthen that parent-child relationship.
Okay.
So the first one is simply use your eyes. And, they emphasize the power of eye contact to convey love, respect, meet those fundamental emotional needs.
Okay. The second one is use your heart.
Yeah, stressing the importance of truly loving our children for who they are and expressing that love through heartfelt words and actions, going beyond just the, routine blessings.
Okay. Then the third one is use your ears.
Right. Highlighting that truly listening, actively paying attention to what our kids are saying, even if we don't agree, is one of the most powerful communication tools we have.
Uh-huh.
Because understanding their ideas gives us valuable insight and creates these opportunities to offer different perspectives and teach them how to navigate difficult conversations.
So number 4 is use your mouth, meaning to speak edifying words, to offer blessings, and to speak words of life and encouragement.
That's right. And then number 5 is use your arms.
Uh-huh.
The power of a hug, a touch,
Sure.
to convey love and connection. And they make it clear that this is never about, like, striking or grabbing,
Yeah.
roughly.
And then the final one is to use your feet.
Right, which means being present in their lives,
Yeah.
attending their events, showing interest in their hobbies, sharing their experiences.
I love these. And then they talk about how important it is for parents to be willing to ask for forgiveness from their children when we mess up
Yeah.
or when we unintentionally hurt their feelings.
Right. They discuss how unjust discipline, things like accusing them wrongly or having rules they don't understand, can deeply wound a child's spirit and erode their trust in us. And they stress the importance of admitting when we've made a mistake, offering a sincere apology, and trying to make amends. And then, this is really powerful, they address the incredibly damaging effects of parental rejection or neglect, noting that research actually suggests that it can be even more harmful than overt physical abuse,
Wow.
especially for very young children.
Yeah.
And they differentiate between overt rejection, which is more obvious, and covert rejection,
Uh-huh.
which can take more subtle forms like overprotectiveness that prevents them from growing, overindulgence that hinders their development of responsibility, or withdrawing affection as a punishment.
And they do offer some practical advice for how to begin reopening a child's heart after these kinds of wounds.
Yeah, they emphasize the need to act promptly and directly, to express empathy for how the child is feeling, to listen patiently to their perspective without getting defensive, to acknowledge our part in what happened without making excuses, and to sincerely ask for their forgiveness. And, they remind us that sometimes forgiveness isn't immediate, and we may need to be prepared to follow up and just continue showing our love and commitment to healing the relationship.
That leads into this important shift in their discussion, which is moving from law to grace. And they caution us about the danger of our children feeling lost or disconnected as they enter adolescence if we continue to rely solely on this rigid set of external rules.
Right. They emphasize the need to help them develop an internal compass guided by the golden rule. And for us as parents to model the kind of behavior and respect that we want to see in them.
And they talk about the challenge of transitioning from those very clear-cut rules that made sense during childhood to this more nuanced understanding of right and wrong and the role of grace as they move toward adulthood.
Yeah, and they acknowledge that conveying grace can be difficult, especially if we as parents haven't fully grasped it ourselves, which can sometimes lead to another form of legalism, just a different set of rules. They use that beautiful passage from Galatians about the heir. While he's young, he's treated like a servant, even though he owns everything.
Yeah.
And it illustrates that transition from being under the strict guidance of the law to becoming adopted children with direct access to God through the Spirit.
So they're explaining that the purpose of the law was really to show us our own limitations, and that true righteousness doesn't come from following a set of rules, but comes through Christ, through love, and through grace.
Exactly. And they contrast that really damaging message of legalistic parenting.
Uh-huh.
Those messages that make a child feel inherently flawed or never good enough,
Right,
or
right.
the message of love and grace, which is all about acceptance and growth. And they suggest that, a heavy focus solely on rules and performance can contribute to young adults walking away from their faith. They emphasize that God's primary desire is for a relationship with us, not just our obedience to a list of rules.
Mhm.
And as Christians, we have a new heart with internal guidance, transformed by the very nature of Jesus through our connection with him.
So what does graceful parenting look like? So it's guiding our teens to develop a genuine love for God with Jesus at the center of their lives, rather than just adhering to this system of do's and don'ts.
Exactly. It involves teaching them the biblical reasons behind our principles and boundaries. Grace also allows teenagers the space to make their own decisions and even their own mistakes under our guidance as opportunities for learning and growth.
Uh-huh.
As they demonstrate responsibility, that should naturally lead to increased freedom. And they also caution against over-restricting teenagers, based on our own past experiences or fears, and encouraging us to trust that a teen with a solid foundation in God may well make wise choices.
Yeah, and they clarify that true training involves more than just exposing our kids to a Christian environment. It's about actively equipping them and conditioning their hearts. They highlight the role of teaching them respect and obedience to parental authority as this foundational step for learning and growing in all areas of life. And they reference J. Richard Fuggate's idea that biblical child training aims to produce a distinct kind of character that goes beyond natural development.
That's right. And from there, they move into the often turbulent years of enjoying adolescence.
Okay.
They acknowledge that it's this period of significant changes, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and with increased independence comes new challenges and temptations.
Uh-huh.
However, they challenge the notion that adolescent rebellion is just normal and therefore something we should simply accept.
Mm.
They believe that while we might expect some pushback, outright rebellion shouldn't be allowed to take root. And what's needed is guidance that's authoritative, meaning firm and clear,
Yeah.
but not authoritarian, controlling and unyielding. So they revisit those three key elements for thriving during adolescence: knowledge, seeing the world and our choices from God's perspective; wisdom, responding to situations with Christ-like character; and understanding, capturing God's heart and aligning our desires with his. They mention what they call the sprowing year, often around 7th grade, where principles that might have seemed solid earlier are suddenly challenged.
Uh-huh.
And they warn against getting swept up in changing cultural opinions and lowering our expectations for teenagers, because that can lead to unintentionally enabling negative behaviors through placating and coddling. They even include this kind of satirical list from the Houston Police Department called 12 Rules for Raising Delinquent Children.
Okay.
And, it's intended as humor, but it shines a light on those common parenting missteps.
And then they come back to the purpose of boundaries and limits. They're to protect our kids from harm, to restrain those negative impulses, to help them learn to regulate themselves, and to prepare them for living responsibly in society. They emphasize that a lack of clear boundaries early on can hinder the development of self-control as they get older, and the consequences they experience when they cross those boundaries become crucial teaching moments for internalizing those controls.
Right, and in the next section, Edifying Words Empower, the Tsika has discussed the two sides of effective discipline.
Okay.
Correction when needed, but also, and maybe more importantly, consistent encouragement,
Yeah.
which they feel is often lacking. And they caution against getting too focused on superficial external issues rather than addressing what's really going on in a child's heart.
So they remind us that our children's true worth and potential are determined by God, not by the, ever-shifting standards of society. They share a story about a successful young woman who made the deliberate choice to prioritize family time over work, illustrating the importance of focusing on what truly matters in the long run. And they point out how easily society, and even we as parents, can fall into the trap of focusing almost exclusively on correcting weaknesses rather than recognizing and nurturing our children's strengths.
Yeah, they use the example of someone with this natural gift for connecting with people being encouraged towards a career in sales. And they powerfully highlight the impact of our words, referencing Proverbs, which tells us that kind words can heal while careless words can wound.
It's so true.
They emphasize that when we offer training and correction, it should always be to reinforce what is right. And that consistent encouragement is vital for strengthening positive behaviors.
Yeah.
And they list several common parental behaviors that can shut down communication and close a child's heart, such as lecturing without listening, being inconsistent in our responses, publicly humiliating them, breaking promises, being overly negative, constantly comparing them to others, and simply being insensitive to their feelings.
Yeah, they remind us of that desire that most children have to please their parents and to feel affirmed by them.
Yeah.
And they describe words as these little packages of meaning that have the power to either inspire and build up or to tear down and destroy.
And they discuss the biblical concept of blessing our children, not based on their performance or merit,
Yeah.
but simply because they belong to God. And they even touch on the Jewish tradition of the bar mitzvah as a powerful ritual of blessing.
So, what are the key elements that make a blessing impactful?
Well, they outline 5. Encouraging physical touch, speaking meaningful and specific words, communicating the high value we place on them, painting a vision of a positive future, and actively committing to helping them fulfill that potential.
Mhm.
And, they share a powerful anecdote from Bill Gothard's work about a couple in New Zealand who used the practice of blessing to completely transform their struggling son and their whole family dynamic. And they also mentioned Craig Hill's observation about the tragic consequences when parents failed to speak blessings over their children, emphasizing, that life-giving or death-dealing power our words can hold. And they suggest incorporating routines of blessing into our family life, such as using regular family meals as opportunities for children to be seen and to be heard and to learn the art of conversation and expressing their beliefs. And they encourage